Uh, Welcome to the last panel in City Debates. I know it's been a long time. I know you're tired, but we are so excited because we have a very promising discussion ahead. So we will start just for the sake of time. Gokce will join us shortly. We will start with Sarah. First, let me introduce myself. Sorry. My name is Rana Sukkari. I'm an assistant professor of sociology here at AUB, and I will be moderating this session. So we will start with Sarah El-Kazaz. She will talk about politics in the crevices, urban design, and the making of property markets in Cairo and Istanbul. Sarah is an associate professor in the politics department at SOAS, University of London, and author of Politics in the Crevices, Urban Design and the Making of Property Markets in Cairo and Istanbul. Her research interests include critical political economy, urbanism, infrastructure and digital politics, and her new book project investigates the politics of digital infrastructures by following cloud technologies across the global south. Her work appears in peer-reviewed journals, including Comparative Studies in Society and History, City and Society. She previously taught at Oberlin College and completed her PhD at Princeton University. Sarah, maximum 20 minutes. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all for being here. I know it's really great of you to be here right after lunch, so I appreciate it. I want to say a quick thank you for this incredible invitation to Mona Harb, Mona Fawaz, and the Beirut Urban Lab, and also to Isabella and Antonia for incredible work putting all of this together. And a special thank you to everyone who runs this space for creating the kind of space that allows these kinds of conversations, amplifies the voices that we need the most at a time like this. So thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to jump right in. I've been told that it's a very strict timing, so I'm going to try my best to stick to it. So today's presentation is coming out of my book that was very recently published through Duke University Press. I'm going to take you through a number of vignettes to try to build up towards some of the arguments I'm making in the book. But of course, there's so much more that can't really be covered in the 20 minutes, so look forward to that in the Q&A. So here I go. Hagga Samia and her ailing mother have lived in a Mamluk-style building in the neighborhood of Darb al-Ahmar in historic Cairo that borders a 74-acre garbage dump for decades. Throughout her life, Hagga Samia's family could see the dump's heaps of rubbish from the living room windows, its putrid smells wafting over every time wind gusted in from the east. The building had also been left unmaintained for decades, and when an earthquake shook Cairo to its core in 1992, its structure started to fracture. After living with the fear of impending collapse for half a decade, the family's fortunes took a decided turn in the late 1990s. A developmental organization based in The Hague, the Aga Khan Foundation, or the El Khan Foundation, had taken an interest in its corner of Cairo, embarking on 2 urban transformation projects in Darb al-Ahmar. Initially, in 1995, the foundation embarked on a project that would excavate the garbage dump and transform it into one of Central Cairo's largest green spaces, Azhar Park. Then in 1997, the foundation initiated a home restoration program that would eventually restore 120 buildings in Darb al-Ahmar. Hagga Samia's home was selected for the pilot phase of the program and offered a grant that would cover 90% of the costs of restoring the building from the inside out. So, I hope this works. Let's see. Okay, there we go. So this is an image showing the work of the Al Khan Foundation in Darb al-Ahmar as it was restoring the neighborhood. And this is Al-Azhar Park. So when I visited Hagga Samia in her restored home in 2011, she took me throughout the building, showing me every intricate detail of the restorations with much pride and joy. When our discussion turned to plumbing, The joy on Hagga Samia's face dissipated. Working hard not to seem ungrateful, she explained that the plumbing system that the Ayham team had installed was more difficult to use than the original. Whereas each apartment had had its own water supply before the restorations, the engineers had installed a shared water pump in the building. Hagga Samia now had to negotiate with her neighbors about when she would be able to pump water up to her apartment, because only one apartment could use it at a time. The pumping system struck me as strange too, and I filed it away along with other oddities as intriguing designs that I would ask the engineers about. At that point, however, I assumed that there would be a straightforward technical logic to explain them. When I did ask the foundation's engineers about the odd designs, their explanation was anything but technical. They were decidedly political. Sami, an urban planner on the foundation's team, explained the shared water pumps as follows. And I should say all the names used here are pseudonyms. By the way, these are views from Hagga Samia's home. This is Azhar Park from her rooftop garden, and these are the minarets of Cairo. So Sami said, quote, "Our purpose was that you learn to coordinate with your neighbors. So, for example, when we installed water pumps, we would find that in a building with 6 residents, each of the residents wants to install their own water pump. We would refuse such requests because if they can't resolve issues around using a water pump, then there's no sense in them restoring the house altogether. In other words, they have to talk to each other." End quote. Pumping water up building pipes wasn't the only work expected of the water pump the foundation had installed in Hagga Samia's building. Working quietly from within the invisible crevices of building walls, water pumps were expected to engineer collaborative community, as neighbors were forced to discuss sharing the water being pumped up to their floors. The Ayham team was designing the intricate features of restored homes to perform the work of societal engineering. Sami then placed that socio-political work within a larger vision, saying, and I quote, "The idea behind the project wasn't that we fixed Darb al-Ahmar. Darb al-Ahmar has more than 5,500 residential buildings, and we fixed little over 100 of those. It's a drop in the ocean. Housing rehabilitation was a tool towards something bigger. It was a step towards ensuring the existing community didn't leave. The foundation was working to reverse the displacement of Cairo's most vulnerable populations from the city's core, as the deregulation of property markets worked with several other forces to push them out of Cairo's core. Engineering collaborative community through the careful design of housing restorations would, presumably, strengthen the bonds residents had with their neighborhood and how valuable they saw their property, producing a counterweight to the highly capitalized forces pushing them out of the center. The foundation was intervening in the workings of historic Cairo's real estate market. As my research progressed, I realized that Sami and his team weren't the only ones turning to unorthodox methods to fight for affordable housing in the city. Through a multi-sided ethnography in Istanbul and Cairo of 6 neighborhoods undergoing large-scale urban transformation projects, I found a battle for housing raging in both cities. And here you can see sort of a before and after in Darb al-Ahmar. A variety of state and non-state actors were fighting to secure affordable housing on the one side and to corner real estate markets for a luxury clientele on the other. This battle was not raging in traditional political arenas, however. Rather than agitate for familiar redistributive policies like housing subsidies, exclusive land grants, or rent controls, urban protagonists were relying on the subtle, quiet machinations of urban planning and design to redistribute and restrict access to the city's housing. In Istanbul, a group of urban activists turned to the heritage industry to secure affordable housing along the Golden Horn by reframing private residences like these into globally valued heritage. And I'm going to come back to this case. Meanwhile, the Turkish state appropriated a grassroots environmental movement seeking protections for the city against against natural disasters and especially earthquakes to devalue affordable housing in the city center as prone to collapse and a hazard to the city, which then led to the forced evacuation of a neighborhood like Tarlabaşı, Istanbul, which you see here, as it worked to transfer that property to developers. Back in Cairo, a corporate developer worked to corner downtown's real estate market not through corruption but by mobilizing building aesthetics, a topography of hidden alleyways, and the Egyptianization of commercial culture to render property exclusive, secure, and valuable to a luxury clientele. Time and again, urban protagonists were deploying the careful design of the urban built environment to do the work of restricting and redistributing access to housing. The battle for housing was alive and well. In particular, careful urban design was expected to transform how property was valued in a neighborhood so as to favor particular groups over others on quote-unquote freely traded real estate markets, fostering what I conceptualize as particularistic value. Markets are fundamentally circuits for the exchange of commodities. Commodities are only exchangeable if their value is calculable and recognizable on those circuits. As an incisive body of literature has shown, the value of any given commodity is not a naturally occurring fact, simply discoverable on the open market. Competing actors dedicate considerable work to defining how the value of a potential commodity, like a home, gets calculated on the open market. When our protagonists designed urban built environments that would engineer community, preserve heritage, decrease disaster hazards, or evoke cultural movements, they were investing considerable work into shifting how particular groups came to value their neighborhood's urban fabric. Engineering a wholesale shift in how that urban fabric is valued would transform its legibility and calculability as exchangeable real estate in favor of some groups over others. In other words, they were mobilizing a carefully designed urban built environment to produce particularistic value through which they intervene in the workings of real estate markets. The battle for housing in Cairo and Istanbul was unfolding from within the rationales of market dynamics as a struggle over how the value of homes were being defined, claimed, and experienced. This book asks what happens when the value over protections for vulnerable populations shifts from pushing back and contesting the boundaries of the market to finding ways of operating within it. How do we come to understand and locate the workings of the political when battles over the distribution of a city's resources operate from within the logics of the market? Now, critical scholars have assumed for a long time the absence of a political machinery of redistribution specifically under a neoliberal order that unequivocally empowers one class over another, or is defined by what David Harvey would call accumulation by dispossession. Now, there are, of course, exceptions to this that I'd love to talk about. Now, I completely agree with this scholarship in that the neoliberal intellectual and political project, born out of the anxieties of a global corporate capitalist class in crisis, especially as it could not rely on direct colonialism to buttress capitalist accumulation, it was driving this process of systemic neoliberalization. But I disagree with this scholarship that these class foundations had successfully permeated the inner workings of neoliberalism and seamlessly translated into neoliberal machinery that foreclosed the space for class-based redistributive struggles and the politics of that within that system. So questioning that assumption, I find that markets are malleable and are being deployed to perform a variety of contradictory political projects. Now, what does that mean for the political? One of the conclusions of this literature is that neoliberalism operates through depoliticizing the political. I argue instead that what we are witnessing is a displacement of the political onto the contested design of the most private and intimate spaces of the city as they're deployed to manipulate markets. In other words, in spite of the performance of depoliticization, political struggles don't actually disappear. They seep into the city's built environment, burdening its intimate and visible and private spaces with the weighty burden of the political projects neoliberalism was presumed to have effaced. In doing so, these political burdens create innumerable contradictions in the city, like Hagga Samia's inconvenient water pumps. And as urban protagonists challenge those contradictions in everyday life, they repeatedly reanimated the politics so many actors were working to obfuscate. Now let me move to my ethnography once more to think through that repoliticization. I move now back to Fenerbahçe in Istanbul, and this is actually the image from the cover. And there, urban activists were, to kind of give you context to the project, you saw urban activists coming out of the Habitat Conference in 1996 that took place in Istanbul that was most concerned with safeguarding the right to shelter in the city. And they turned not to other kind of traditional modes of safeguarding affordable housing, but to heritage as their redistributive tactic. So to safeguard affordable housing, they worked to convince the world that the private residences of Fenerbahçe were globally valued heritagescapes and enlisted the EU to implement this project. I can talk a lot about this project. I would rather move to thinking about repoliticization from the homes they restored. So the Denizli family's 3-story home in Fener neighborhood overlooking the Golden Horn was built by a Greek family at the turn of the 20th century. They volunteered their home to be restored through the EU's rehabilitation project in the neighborhood in 2003-04. But 3 years before the EU had approached the Denizli family about restoring their home, their living room walls had suffered from water leakage, and they had to replaster them. As they removed the gypsum and paint layers of the wall in the course of their repairs, they made an unexpected discovery. Instead of uncovering layers of ugly brick, they were astounded to find colorful walls beneath the gypsum. Emel Hanem and her son Hussein attempted to describe what they found in great detail as I sat in their living room. Quote, "The bricks were covered with a white lime-based plastering material. We didn't know this plastering material today," started Hussein. The plaster was covered by handcrafted designs that came together to form what Hussein described as, quote, "an enormous richly adorned tableau or painting," end quote. According to Emel Hanem, they found such tableaus in several rooms of the house, not just the living room. She described them as follows, quote, "The painting would cover the wall from top to bottom, and in the middle a different dessin, or design, would be found. In other words, it was like a painting. Each wall had a different design at the center. For example, this room's," pointing to the adjacent room, "this room's design was different. They used at least 3 to 4 colors. There was yellow, there was green," end quote. Hussein then expressed the marvel at the preservation of the colors. Oh, thank you. Perfect. Where for, quote, "decades had passed and yet the colors remained vivid, canlı renkler. Truly, we were astonished by the vivid colors," end quote. After much deliberation with my research associate, Jem Bijou, we came to the conclusion that what the Denizli family had uncovered beneath layers of paint and gypsum were most likely fresco-based murals. The reason why Emel Hanem and her son Hussein had to go to such lengths to describe the murals to me was that I could not see them anymore. As I sat in their living room in June of 2012, all I could see were plain walls covered in white paint. The question then became, where are these murals? The Denizli family had actively covered the murals. Emel Hanem explained, and I quote, "They were so beautiful that we covered the walls to ensure that the UNESCO not see them, because they would not have given us permission to plaster over them. They would have forced us to restore them," end quote. Hussein then explained that when they had originally uncovered the murals, they had contemplated restoring them, but that they neither found the materials nor the craftsmen necessary to restore the walls. Quote, "It would have required archaeologists or specialized university students. It would have required both a long time commitment and a large financial investment to restore. Perhaps if we had the resources, we would have done it, but who is capable of that?" End quote. As a result, once they heard the rumors that the EU was going to start the implementation phase of their project in 2003, they immediately covered the murals because, and I quote, "the UNESCO could not see it. Had they seen it, for sure they would have restored it. End quote. Ultimately, in fear of the EU restoration team's zeal, the Denizli family rushed to cover the murals adorning their home's original walls. While she narrated the uncovering and covering of the murals, Ahmed Hanem walked me from room to room on their home's main floor, vividly describing the designs and colors of the murals that covered each wall. As she painted the murals before my eyes, she radiated with pride. Her home was not like any other home in the district. Hers was a distinguished home adorned by rare and beautiful murals on every wall, even if not visible. Twinned with her pride was a visible agitation. She was distraught by a sense of loss for the murals we could not see. The Denizli family did not cover the murals out of simple ignorance of their historical or aesthetic value, as many conservationists lamented to me. Far from it. They had such a deep appreciation for their value that they shared with me the story of their uncovering and covering at the risk of sounding ignorant of its value, or of that information going back to zealous conservationists, to impress upon me just how special their home was. Theirs was hardly the work of ignorant laymen, inadvertently destroying heritage as they went about their daily lives with no appreciation for the historical. The Denizli family was making a pragmatic decision to cover the murals as they challenged an order that put the murals above their well-being. Rather than being an unconditional subsidy, getting access to funding that would secure the safety of their home structure, beautify its fixtures, was being conditioned on the obsessively accurate conservation of their home's historical materiality. As they covered the murals to outmaneuver an order that put the worth of buildings and their historical materiality over people, the Denizli family had undermined the essence of that order by remaking their physical world and actively hiding the artifacts that the market had prized as the neighborhood's most valuable assets. In hiding the murals, the Denizli family, like so many of the protagonists I encountered, were re-politicizing the political projects, redistributive and otherwise, that were being displaced and obfuscated through the machinations of the market, not through direct political context, but through technical contestations of the design of electrical wiring, balconies, rooftops, and title deeds, and in this case, actively hiding prized artifacts. While tracing these subtle micro-practices of repoliticization recuperates the political and locates it in the intimate, the private, and the invisible crevices of the city, it also unmasks the dangers of such displacement to political life. When political struggles are obscured as they become insidiously channeled into market rationales, the overt political spaces through which these struggles were once negotiated close up. Having nowhere to go, that politics doesn't disappear. Instead, it manifests and festers within intimate spaces and sites that are much more difficult to negotiate and recuperate as a polity. The displacement of the political onto the city's intimate and private crevices under a neoliberal order leaves us with a political climate that fosters suspicion and a fracturing polity. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. We're going to move right now to Gokce Gunel. So just for the sake of time, I'm just do not go in details into the biography. You can find it online. Gokce will be, her presentation is entitled as Seascape of Power, Turkish Energy Infrastructure in Ghana. 20 minutes. I'm going to give you a sign on 5 minutes and then 2 minutes. Is that fine? Thank you.
So much. Thank you again, and thank you for the support. So my work broadly analyzes how infrastructure and urbanism... Oh, sure. Sorry, of course. My work broadly analyzes how infrastructure and cities transform amid climate change and energy-related challenges. And I wrote a book about the construction of an eco-city in Abu Dhabi called Masdar City. And so my interest in the energy transition started there. But now I'm writing a book that's trying to analyze the discourse of energy transition more broadly. And I'm going to share some of that work with you, even though I think, let's see how much of the actual critique of the energy transition discourse you're going to get in this presentation. But I tried to pick something that would be of interest to everyone here. Okay. So in addressing urgent electricity demands, many countries are looking toward quick power generation systems. And one emergent system is power ships, floating power plants that anchor at a harbor, plug into a national grid, and generate electricity with heavy fuel oil or natural gas. So the Turkish company Karadeniz Holding, or Car Power, as it's known to many of its clients, has become an increasingly popular producer of power ships in the past 2 decades. A family-owned business, Car Power builds the ships on spec in various shipyards in Istanbul and leases them to places with high energy demands. The barge Ayşegül Sultan anchored in the Tema fishing harbor in Ghana and produced power for the country's grid between December 2015 and September 2017, initiating the company's operations in Africa. And as some of you may know, this same barge would later service Lebanon. So this larger power ship, Osman Khan, replaced Ayşegül Sultan in late 2017, almost doubling Car Power's production volume. And other projects were planned and operational in Iraq, Lebanon, Indonesia, Pakistan, Zambia, Sierra Leone, Gambia, Mozambique, Senegal, Libya, South Africa, and the list goes on. Car Power labeled their project The Power of Friendship, presenting it as a cordial campaign to bring quick and cheap electric power to those in need. So as temporary and market-based systems, power ships did not represent the arrival of progress. Instead, their producers promoted them as liminal devices whose obsolescence would allow for a renewable energy future. In contrast, historian Stefan Mischer shows how Ghana's Volta Dam produced different temporalities of an industrialized future that would transform the country's rural past and create new cities, factories, and infrastructures. At the dam's inauguration ceremony in January 1966, Kwame Nkrumah, who's the first president of independent Ghana and a Pan-African statesman, announced, "It is in the spirit of fruitful collaboration for a better world that I inaugurate the Volta River Project. Let us dedicate it to Africa's progress and prosperity. Only in this way will Africa play its full part in the achievement of world peace and for the advancement of the happiness of mankind." Nkrumah was overthrown by a military coup a few months after the ceremony. So inadequate rainfall and rising temperatures associated with climate change have negatively impacted the Volta Dam, at times completely incapacitating it. An electricity crisis between 2012 and 2015 resulted in unprecedented power cuts throughout Ghana. Power for industries and homes was out for 24 hours at a time and turned back on only for 12-hour periods. Doomsor, the name given to the crisis that means off and on in Twi, was brought about by low water levels in hydroelectric dams, disruptions to natural gas flows from Nigeria, and alleged mismanagement of the grid infrastructure. In response, Ghanaian decision makers saw a further expansion of the country's energy portfolio as a solution to the crisis, shifting the nation's energy production away from hydropower and towards fossil fuels. And today, fossil fuel-powered thermal plants produce about 2/3 of Ghana's electricity. Okay. Car Power could have built a land-based power plant here, but they did not, Car Power's Ghana director Serkan explained as we had lunch at a restaurant in Accra. Instead, they built the plant on a barge. If Ghanaians gave us a concrete slab and allowed us to place a plant on that slab, Karadeniz would have done that, but we did not. He picked up a clean white napkin off the table, then he folded it 4 times until it was the size of a stick of gum. "This is how much space our barge takes," he said. "This is how much more effective it is when compared to a land-based power plant. And if the authorities don't pay, or if there's a war, then we take our barge and leave." By folding the napkin, Serkan was taking a seemingly 2-dimensional object, which was flat and spread out, and rendering it 3-dimensional. Unlike a regular power plant, the floating power plant was thick and densely packed. The act of folding represented a transformation from a horizontal organization to an organization that was layered and vertical, a space where everything would be stacked up. With scrubber towers on the top, workers in the middle, and engines at the bottom level, the ship would constitute an enclosed world for power production, attached to the Ghanaian grid with high-frequency cables stretching over the harbor. According to Serkan, the innovative barge had many advantages both for the company and for the Ghanaian authorities. Power ships differentiate themselves from competitors through their formal qualities, namely by being ships that can move from sites of production to sites of consumption, relatively independent of logistics networks. Unlike other systems of generation, the construction of power ships is undertaken in a different environment than where the plant will function. By centralizing production in shipyards in Istanbul, the company controls its operations efficiently. And power ships don't require large pieces of land, making the projects more desirable for leasing countries. Once they arrive at the harbor, the only supplement the power ship necessitates is high-frequency cables that connect the ship to the nearest substation. So in the case of Temagana, for instance, this substation was 9 kilometers away, and this is the wires you see here. Finally, since their only connection to the land is through high-frequency cables, power ships also seem more tenuous than land-based plants, giving the appearance that the ship could leave any time. Yet the ship in Ghana has stayed. We oversolved the problem, a member of Ghana's Energy Commission reflected on the crisis. Between 2015 and 2020, Ghana's electricity supply went from 2,800 megawatts to 5,000 megawatts. The new power plants triggered an excess of electricity on the country's grid. And despite a condition of electricity excess, the power ship has stretched this liminal presence in Ghana to suit a range of financial and political interests. During a meeting in Beirut in 2017, Shahin, one of the board members of Car Power, had in fact criticized such long-term contracts in the electricity market, telling me that they did not satisfy the dynamic industry needs and positioning their ships as short-term alternatives. I must have visited Beirut at least 500 times in the past 5 years, he said, trying to give me a sense of how he managed the 2 floating power plants that serviced Lebanon then. As he described these longer-term investments, he referred to Confessions of an Economic Hitman, a New York Times bestseller published in 2004 and one of Shahin's favorite books. In the book, John Perkins provides a semi-autobiographical account of how American engineering companies made deals with leaders from the global south and strong-armed them to accept substantial development loans for large construction and engineering projects. Confessions of an Economic Hitman offered Shahin a reliable map of global politics with energy at its helm. Interestingly, Shahin situated his company's project in opposition to these larger contracts with long-lasting impacts. Even though the floating power plants were a byproduct of the US interventions in Iraq in the 1990s and 2000s, and I'm happy to talk about this process during the Q&A, which comprised a significant section of this book, Shahin differentiated his company's objectives by suggesting that they embraced the short term as the primary space for capitalist intervention. As nimble prosthetics for collapsing electricity production systems, the ships would offer emergency relief, assisting countries that had for decades been devastated by the kinds of large-scale engineering and construction projects that Perkins described in his book. Such focus on the short term endowed the floating power plants with a new kind of ethical function, rendering them distinct tools for development. Despite the various kinds of attachment that their company's projects necessitated, including taking 500 ships from Istanbul to Beirut over 5 years, representatives of Car Power stressed that their work concentrated on what constitutes now. Such invocations of the short term as a space for capitalist intervention offered them 2 advantages. First, it allowed them to differentiate themselves from companies originating from the global north, presenting them with the ability to provide seemingly ethical tools for development that would serve as bridge technologies. They identified with Perkins' critique of extractive capitalist practice and imagined themselves as providing an alternative business model. The ship's formal capacity as a floating platform that could appear or sail away gave further legitimacy to these claims. Second, the invocations of the short term provided Car Power representatives with an opportunity to situate themselves in the telos of progress, where their products would merely serve as liminal devices. As energy production facilities that would appear quickly when necessary and disappear when the countries no longer needed their assistance, floating power plants would pave the way for producing renewable energy. In a global and regional context where the telos of development has lost its credibility, the narrative of energy transition reintroduced such imaginations of linear progress. In some ways, this critique of long-term and extractive capitalist practice echoed the forms of foreign policy that the Turkish government has advocated, precipitating what historian Ayşe Çavdar has called imperialism by anti-imperialists. For instance, the Turkish government introduced its foreign policy mechanisms to African countries, highlighting that the Ottoman Empire never participated in the Atlantic slave trade. Şahin's reference to John Perkins' Confessions of an Economic Hitman fulfilled a similar role, underlining the extractive practices employed by companies from the global north and presenting expertise from Turkey as a means for amending such exploitative contracts and offering an alternative path forward. During an official address at the Dakar International Conference Center in March 2018, Erdogan emphasized, depleting Africa's resources and adopting a modern colonial system is not our style. Similarly, car power representatives frame themselves as companions in misfortune, suffering from the effects of the same fraudulent policies imposed by the global north, and broadly trying to attend to the effects of historical injustices such as the Atlantic slave trade or imperialist US interventions in the Middle East. During a diplomatic trip I attended, a Turkish executive from a company with successful businesses all over Africa told me how they were tasked with showcasing Turkey's business capacity. Turkish investments in Africa not only relied on such non-imperialist imperialism, but also sustained and augmented it. Power producers such as Car Power were poster children of Turkey's expansion to African markets, acting as what some called a soft power mechanism employed to exert Turkish foreign policy there. Such Turkish exports to Africa also added to Erdogan's popularity back home in Turkey. Therefore, despite the emphasis on the short term, Car Power's operations in Ghana demanded long-term multi-scalar relations, including those that happen at the nation-state level and are cultivated constantly by company executives. In other words, the simple makeshift qualities of provisional power infrastructure were made possible by long-term geopolitical and geo-economic connections between Turkey and the leasing countries. Companies' employees attempted to construct a sense of familiarity with their counterparts as well, echoing the company's slogan, "The power of friendship." Yet relations between Car Power and its counterparts were not free from tensions and controversy. In practice, the discourse of familiarity and trust was combined with a particular contractualism, wherein take-or-pay contracts remained in use regardless of how they impacted the government's interests. In these contracts, the take-or-pay clause required buyers to purchase electricity from the producer or compensate the producer with a predetermined penalty if they did not consume the electricity promised. For instance, in examining the Lebanese electricity market, where power ships produced electricity between June 2012 and May 2021, this World Bank report suggested, with hindsight, it would likely have been cheaper to have invested in permanent capacity rather than keep paying high take-or-pay charges. In their investigative reporting on Car Power, reporters from South Africa's non-profit news service, Amabungane, claimed that when a power ship entered the market, it remained there for the entirety of the 20-year contract, regardless of whether it produced electricity for the grid. The reporters highlighted the problems with power ship contracts, arguing it appeared that Car Power had a practice of entering new markets by paying large facilitation fees to politically exposed persons, which could be constructed as bribery. All in all, the rhetoric of friendship paralleled extractive practices that ensured corporate benefits. Like many independent power producers, Car Power's ships had entered the Ghanaian market on these take-or-pay contracts, leaving the country with a significant financial burden. At the Energy Conference CERAWeek in Houston in March 2023, a deputy minister from Ghana's Ministry of Energy summed up the country's current state of electricity production and consumption, comparing its infrastructure to that to other countries such as South Africa and Kenya. The solution to power outages between 2011 and 2016 was to aggregate more power in a non-transparent manner, he recapped, and now we have electricity excess. In trying to capture the scale of the issue, the deputy minister explained that at specific points in the past years, the Ghanaian government had paid 33% of its tax revenue for excess capacity. Overall, the deputy minister's comments demonstrated how take-or-pay contracts undermine the imagination of power ships as ethical infrastructure and delegitimized the claim that Ghana and Turkey had participated in this contractual process as equals. While enabling a liminal period, power ships also postponed ideas of progress to an era that would commence upon their departure. They would pragmatically attend to routine consumer demand until they were eventually replaced by clean and renewable electricity generation. Since their work depended on market-based contracts, floating power plants seemed more temporary when compared to state-sponsored infrastructure projects such as Ghana's Volta Dam. Complying with the logics of the market, the executives who ran the power ships wished to stretch and expand that near future as much as possible. As the power ships remained in Ghana, these yet-to-come and anticipated visions of future potential grew ever more distant. As businesses operating according to market logics, temporary power producers were financially and politically invested in extending this in-between period as far into the future as possible, suspending the arrival of the era beyond their obsolescence. So in some ways, the long-term relations I described enabled such deferral. Yet the power ship's temporary presence in Ghana signified a prolonged period of liminality and state of in-betweenness with particular temporal and spatial qualities, which would eventually lead to a renewable energy future. While they rely on power ships, countries like Ghana could invest in renewables. Serkan, the country director of Car Power in Ghana, echoed a common opinion, seeing temporary systems as interim solutions that could enable Ghana to vault over to a renewable energy future, such as rooftop solar panels or small-sized on-the-grid power stations, indicating their potentiality. Yet, given the financial burden accrued through independent power producers, it had proven challenging to invest in solar power infrastructure. And this solar power station I show here is a very small power station that's owned by the Chinese, state-based Chinese company. By remaining on the grid and accruing debt for the Ghanaian economy, independent power producers such as the power ship suspended the future visions of renewable energy development. As safe, mobile, and easy-to-manufacture technologies, power ships enabled a state of liminality, a brief pause when Ghanaian authorities would perhaps make plans towards this renewable energy future. And in this context, Serkan's comment implied that temporary power has made planning for the future possible. Representatives from Electricity Company of Ghana, Environmental Protection Agency, and Ghana Grid Company supported this imagination of a renewable energy future. But when I asked them what they think about the power ships, they summarized the process as it is a story of when the provisional becomes permanent. During the time of power ships, such renewable energy could incrementally be built, although this project was often deferred. Overall, the power ship's infrastructural liminality positioned Car Power as a provider of short-term help necessary only until Ghana moves along the imagined telos of energy transition. This emphasis differentiated Car Power from imperialist global north actors, imbuing the company with an ethical function. However, installing power ships relied upon and reproduced long-term multiscalar connections between Turkey and Ghana. And not only did such relations establish Turkey as a soft power in the region, they ultimately deferred the promise of transition to renewable energy, resulting instead in electricity excess. On the power ship, machines were stacked up vertically and ready to take off. In their advertising, the company portrayed this organization as fast-track delivery, high efficiency, and all-integrated plug-and-play project execution. But when I asked Serkan to describe the ships, he did not fall back on this promotional language. Instead, he complemented his folding napkin with a reference to the Vitruvian triad, reciting the three ancient principles of design, firmitas, utilitas, and venustas in Latin. Serkan wished to imagine power ships as commodious, firm, and delightful. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Gokce. Right now, we listen to Momen El-Husseiny and his presentation. The title of his presentation is Urban Governance and Cityness, New Egypt and the Financialized Afterlives of Planning Traditions. Momen, so again, I'll give you a sign at 5 minutes and 2 minutes. All right, thank you.
First of all, I want to thank Professors Mona Fawaz, Mona Hab, Isabella, and Antonia, and the Beirut Urban Lab, the AUB, Professor Huwaida, Dean Alan, Shahida, because actually I was supposed to be here in November, but unfortunately I couldn't come because of the war. Let me start by saying that it's interesting, and I've learned a lot from the amazing panelists, amazing speakers. I'm very, very humbled to be here. When talking about Cairo today, actually I'm bringing war, I'll bring in a lot of things that happened. I'll bring in an excessive work that happened on mapping, together with understanding history and different kind of tools with ethnography. So it's a mixed methods, 10 years of work, and it is an attempt to try to understand what is the new Egypt. Okay. So, I mean, the main argument here is that we have there are lines of flight, and it's very difficult to understand the new administrative capital without looking back into the contemporary history. But sometimes during research that led me to think about going into the Ottoman period and the making of the history. So what I do is actually I work in the desert extensions. And here we're talking about points of departure with non-arrival. And in order to understand the new city, we might have to understand a little bit about the gated communities and the different waves that they have been developed, their messiness, multiplicity, polyvalence, variegated and contradicting urban processes. And it is about unwinding Cairo's desert frontiers. So here I'm going to have 4 things. 1, mapping the physical extensions through time, which relates to geopolitics, wars happening in the region affecting the desert frontiers of Cairo, 6 waves of capitalist growth, political and anti-political kind of protests inside the gated communities at the desert. Then we will look at the master plan of the state, what the state tried to learn from the gated communities. This is where actually all the models of worlding, the interreferential Dubai model did not work. And actually we have multiple timelines of interruption and remaking and unmaking because of learning from things that happened in the gated communities. Then we look at the infrastructure turn, the financialization as an incomplete bandwidth of planning. Then we will look at the optics of financing, the spectacular versus the everyday, agency, disruptions, and post-colonial history. And then the urbanization of the oppressed, politics of the maybe, the urban passant, the chronopolitics of becoming, and what do we do when we are entangled in the middle of things. So let's start by the mapping, and this is going to be a quick one. So these are the Cairo's gated communities. And here we can understand them through time, since starting from the desert extensions from the 1980s until the 2000s. And we have, in 1990, there happened the start of the privatization of the housing market, and it led to a group of gated communities that had a particular set of characteristics of agency, mostly that are homegrown Egyptians or like developers that are Egyptians. Then we have the second wave, which is a very interesting one that rose after 9/11 with Saudi Gulf Arab state and Emirati coming to Cairo to invest because they were diverted from investing in Europe and the US. And then we will have a third wave, which is related to a very interesting thing, that it is an inner protest that was a kind of a rehearsal for 2011 that happened in 2008 and led to the government initiating gated communities for the poor, so to say, and then displacement of certain informalities into the desert inside gated communities. And then we'll have phase 4, wave 4, which is a very interesting thing, that it is about the scalar of gated communities as small ones that are branded and they are small in size. And then in post-2011 with, of course, the Arab Spring, Tahrir Square, and Syrian crisis, Syrian war, the civil war that has happened, led to many influx that then boomed the gated communities. And then the wave 6, which is the state as a gated community developer, so to say, which is about the new administrative capital, but not just the new administrative capital. With the new administrative capital, there has been a plan for 36 new capitals across Egypt. So the constituencies of what makes a gated community, or what makes the state, is very important. So let's go through. So let's go through the waves. So here, this is the ground zero. This is the after the so-called peace treaty with Israel in 1978. Then there happened the 10 settlements that started as deserts. And these were half-finished projects that were mostly abandoned. And then came, and it was mostly for public buildings, public housing, and factories and industrial complexes, that with the intention of creating an economic basis at the edge of the desert. Then the privatization of the desert led to gated communities that are detached across. And the gated communities actually are very interesting of the first wave. Every one of those are like a huge kind of topic, but I'm just running through them because I want to reach to the current moment. But one of them was trying to emulate Walter Disney, like in the US, by creating Walt Disney, like the Dream Park, and actually creating a factory mimicking Ford, Henry Ford. So there is this kind of interesting mutations that have happened in the suburban of America, but it is different. That's why we don't call it the suburban. And then happened something else in the first wave, because of the Gulf War with Iraq and between Iraq and Kuwait. Actually, it led to a little bit of influx of from people from Iraq, and then what actually happened after 9/11 and the 2003 war on Iraq by the US led to more Iraqi refugees coming to gated communities, and actually it created a very interesting heterogeneity. Then here the third wave, which is mostly part of it related to the 6th of April movement in 2008, and together with the WEA, which was interestingly an informality at the edge of a gated communities which was built at a top of Muqattam Hill, that then, because of the excessive use of water, that then to a rock slide that killed many people. So they were displaced into a gated community, but at the edge of the desert. And we'll look at that into the mapping of it and what happened later. And this is the 4th and 5th waves of gated communities that are happening here in the locations of them. And then this is the 6th wave, which is here to the very far right, which is the new administrative capital. Okay. So when we look at the first wave, here is, and I want to run through them because it is actually interesting to know that we have more than 144 gated communities. I know when we're saying about the metropolis or the massive urbanization of Cairo, this is a city that hosts 25 million. Some gated communities reach to that. They are inhabiting 200,000, and some are designed for 500,000. So it is 500,000. So this is the massiveness of this kind of desert frontier. So we're not. It is, and there are actually small sized, but this kind of friction and in-betweenness and incompleteness that allow multiple forces to interplay with that. And here is how it is played out, different kind of locations and across different times, different kind of regions. We can go into that, who is developing land and the military. Why is that? There's dream, class, and security in different ways, different kind of leveraging, different kind of othering happening as a process. But it's interesting to know that the stakeholders is the nation state, New Republic, real estate developers, social classes, and the oppressed, who are actually trying to work through whatever is left and try to navigate and maneuver the given situation. So here are the so-called gated communities, how they are promoted. But actually at the back, you can find inside gated communities certain markets, certain souks, certain kind of working labor at the edge of these gated communities, and gated communities have mutated through time. Not all of them here I'm talking, but they have mutated through time to create sort of open. It is a very interesting thing because it's not public and it's not open, but there are certain areas at the edge that create porous proliferation that is allowing visitors who are non-residents, but it is sort of secured. So this is where it creates certain spaces that are a little bit awkward to say as relationships. Here is for the car parking, here's the cooler. Here's another kind of inside one of the gated communities that turned into a market. Here's Coiffeur Lebanon. I mean, I thought of putting here, I mean, come on, we're in Lebanon. and here's the souk of the food, and there is many sorts of things. But what is interesting is that we will find porous gates, we'll find police stations inside gated communities, sometimes police stations named after gated communities, اسم شرطة الربوة, and so forth, stimulate different political representations inside gated communities. So you'll find a Muslim Brotherhood headquarter inside a gated community that happened after 2011. We'll find, I mean, this is really like, you'll find like the amount of actions and transactions and mobility that is happening across is incredible. You'll find abandoned malls that are waiting for yet to operate. We'll have also social media contestation. So here's another interesting developer that actually rescaled through their operation from El Rabwa to El Rahab to Madinti, and now working with the state. This is a guy who's called Talat Mustafa. I'm sorry, I mean, he was accused of killing Suzanne Tamim, the Lebanese singer, and he was released with the new regime a few years ago, and now he is actually in the game. But this is to give you a sense of how things are rescaling, how this frontier is actually projecting at an urbanized level. So from 550 fidans to 8,000, from 5,000 residents to almost 600,000 residents. And these are examples of police stations, and this is an example of a city hall that is named after, that is interesting because we don't have actually municipalities in Cairo that are not elected, is not operating. Nonetheless, here there is a city hall and it's elected half through the developer and half through the residents. So it's interesting that this kind of game, but it's so interesting when there is a political contestation that then the residents mobilize so that they try to take over the decisions by the developer to create some sort of protests and kind of change for a certain kind of reasoning. So it's incredible. There is a bus station, a whole kind of bus shuttle, and this is like a concession from the group to the infrastructure of the roads outside in Cairo to connect between the ring road or Swiss road and El Rahab. And here are actually interestingly how they are located at the edge. So this is a mall that is at the edge that is designed to open up to the public according to the developer, but the city hall that is half residents decided to oust that kind of or counter that decision, so they actually mobilized to be elected and to prevent it to be opened. So then they outnumbered the votes, so it became abandoned. So here's the idea here, and is that this is a playground. It is a play field for multiple forces, and even the displaced, who are displaced for certain reasons of informality, of eviction, of destruction inside the city, are taking claim of the city, of the gated communities. And here is a gated community that is in Haram City, that then now it became part of it housed by the displaced, and they are claiming it as markets. They are completely playing with it, and you will find Dreamland, Media City, and then Haram City, half of it is by the displaced versus the other group or the original dwellers, and this is how it is promoted. So now when the state forced the real estate developer to host the displaced, they promised to give him another concession for another parcel of land. So they called, the first stage was Haram City. This is where the displaced were moved. Then the second, they created harem life. And they decided that they will turn into modernists. So the first phase, it was Hassan Fathi style. But then they realized that people are doing pigeon houses. So it was not really civilized. So what they did is that they moved to the architecture of the modernist era. Sorry, Nedi. So then it became kind of very modernist, so that then the residents cannot claim the roofs. So you will find interesting kind of language, interesting kind of life within, and this kind of portray. So what is here is that we are having variations and transfiguration, and that actually not all gated communities are the same, but also through the different kind of mapping, what is happening as green spaces and what is public space, what is the meaning of finding mixed uses. We found that there's a church inside a gated community, and then this is another opening that led to another kind of finding. And then when we realized that there are, because of, here's the rehab, one of the gated communities, because it is bounded, that there are certain kind of catalysts, transformation, urban processes happening to the surrounding that are affecting it as an ecosystem of developers. Then we realized that, okay, it is actually developing in phasing, and not all, it is designed to remain incomplete, that there are things that are happening so that then they become concessions for other kind of possibilities. And I'll come to that, something I call the conversion of value. So all these kind of tedious mapping that has been, I've been doing it over the past 10 years, and it's really tedious, but actually it was very helpful to understand through this kind of exercise how things are. When you're mapping and sketching, you will understand, okay, there are things that are happening, why things are developing in a certain manner, how things are changed. That this kind of learning by doing helped one to realize what is happening in the new administrative capital. And I just want to jump to it because I know that this is the most exciting part in it. And here's like even the contours, how it is developed in the uptown, which is in Dubai, kind of in Cairo. So let me jump into this kind of the gated community. Yeah, and gated communities and people labor comes from every part of Egypt. I'll jump into the new administrative capital. So the new administrative capital, it is actually decided to be at the conjunction, and here it is interesting that it is playing at the geopolitical level. So it's connecting between Suez Canal, Ain al-Sukhna. It is going to have a transition. It is meant to, it is designed to be a non-Cairo city. So then it is something as a gateway between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, cutting through infrastructure, cutting across the whole of the urban fabric. And with that, and for this very reasoning, that even the infrastructure is designed that it is incomplete, everything is in the process, in the doing. Here is the Serpentine is actually a green river. It's a metaphor. It is kind of a green park. It's something yet to come, began in the process. But here's what is interesting, and I want to jump into this, is that how the state is operating. So when in 2015, the economic reform, Sharm el-Sheikh, we just started. I mean, okay, fine. So this is the heat of it. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm a mess. So when the new administrative capital was announced, it actually was pronounced as an SOM architectural firm. And they made the master plan as a competition, and the Dubai Amar was very keen that it would take that parcellation. And actually, that made a boom for the regime because it was able to legitimize itself, but also to begin to attract investments. So it was like, interesting, this is it. But soon enough, they interrupted that arrangement. They cut it off. Why? Because a lot of things related to the rationalization of NAC, the idea is that we want to create something that is unfinished, incomplete, And according to the Dubai model or the SOM, we don't operate like that. It's a design, it's a compact city. It is actually a new city in the Masdar kind of sense, but that was not in the minds of whoever was learning from 30 years of development at the desert's frontiers. And this was a very interesting thing, because this was a colloquial in GUC, where in 2019, two very prominent, important figures from Dar al-Handasa, we're speaking to them now in the building. So they came and they said that actually the master plan was given to, was divided across public university professors of Ain Shams to develop it. And the purpose was that it was a conundrum of 5 offices coming together to make things yet to come. And then the Dar al-Handasa came in, and the regime needed some kind of validation. So they transformed the master plan into a number of green lead certificate, and sort of to validate its potential. And it is designed for 6 to 7 million. And actually there was an argument that, do we need that the new administrative capital? And a lot of activists said, oh, we have actually almost 8 million underutilized units, vacancy units. Some people projected it's 12 million. So I think what is interesting here, and here's the 5 components that the Dar al-Handasa worked on to validate, which is the urban design, environmental and ecology. Thank you, Dar al-Handasa, you're great.
It's a sign that you have to wrap up, please, in 1 minute.
Okay.
Please, thank you.
So, okay, it's not working even. Okay, yeah, it's working. So what is interesting here is that let me jump in. Here is the more than 32 new cities. These are the different charts of them. The idea is that through making them, actually they had to carve into the heart of the city, and this is a political meme, as they actually cut through by bulldozers, cutting apartment buildings by half. It actually projected a very similar thing, which is the new kind of strategy for the new cities across Egypt. So the interesting here, a lot of provocations and what is the economic rationales and how it is developed and how it is relating to the literature. But 3 things that really are important here.
Momen, I'm so sorry. You already took 23 minutes.
Okay.
And we still have 1 presentation, and we have to finish at 5. I'm so sorry for that. Okay. Maybe we can leave it to the Q&A if you don't mind. Thank you. Thanks. So the last presentation is by Ayham Dalal. Ayham will be speaking about the Syrian refugee camps in Jordan, from shelters to dwelling.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone, for staying long. I'm the last presentation, so congratulations, you made it. There's also lots of pressure to finish after Momen, of course, so I feel like already have to be running. It wasn't somehow, I will be taking you in a short journey to the work I'm doing in camps, but it was somehow a coincidence that Momen was also talking about rehab. I had to think a lot about this presentation. I thought, okay, maybe I bring the Egyptian context, because now I'm working at German University in Cairo. So this is a picture of the market that Momen was showing, rehab, where there's all these kind of Syrian refugees started to have different kind of activities. And this is one of the most famous, restaurants that's called in the Sham, where you see that it's being used as a drive of investment and urbanization of space. And I'm here interested in refugees and displaced people as city makers, as the work that you've done here at AUB, the brilliant work. And also I worked with my students, of course, in Alexandria, which is one of the cities that's being threatened by massive displacement due to sea level rise, right? And we speak about currently about even 110 million displaced person, and even 1 billion expected refugee that's being due to climate change in 2050. And I'm also interested in the transformation of cities due to displacement. And I think this is a really interesting picture of Amman in the 1950s. This is like 1950s, not long ago, where 30% of the city was inhabited, people lived in tents. And I think this is really a fascinating idea to think of such a big city now, I mean, the capital of Jordan, as city made of, waves of displacement, and how, migrants and refugees actually create cities and create spaces. We also need to think of refugee camps, in particular in the context of the Arab Levant, because it's turning into one of the most prominent urban features in the region. So we speak about, I think, 52, 56, you have to maybe to correct me, Palestinian refugee camps spread across the region. We have also, of course, Armenian camps and all the other camps before, but now Syrian camps. And currently in the northwest region of Syria, we have more than 1,400 small camps, which is, for me, really fascinating. We're speaking about a very small piece of land that is really populated by refugee camps. So this is like becoming more and more like part of the urban, feature of the region. And we have currently 12 million Syrians who are forcibly displaced. All over, the story. And in Jordan, we have around 500,000 Syrian refugees. This is a picture that, the famous ones you see produced by UNHCR, and you see that the concentration of refugees started at the beginning in the north, right? This is underdeveloped part of the kingdom, and at some point there was a decision to kind of construct two camps, which actually many camps, but I will talk about two camps. For those of you who are interested in how refugees actually create cities, I'm also looking more into that in Amman and Cairo. And this is also showing, for example, a map of Amman showing the diversity of people who live in the city: Palestinians, Egyptians, Syrians, Iraqis, Yemenis, Libyans. So all these kind of, also Amman almost turning like a melting pot, right? And we have also the great work that's done by Mona Fawaz and the team, of course, of the Urban Lab, of thinking about informality as a framework. So I'm taking also urban informality as a way of looking at how displaced people produce space and act as city makers. So I'm thinking, so I will look at this the question with you together. So how were Syrian refugee camps in Jordan planned, right? And what happened to their planning? What happened to this planning, and why? I'm interested in this kind of, let's say, transformation, right? That really changed the space of these camps. I have also to say that I had to come up with my own, what Momen was saying, we need to do lots of sketching, and I have to mention that if you look at this map, this is originally what you get if you go to the camp. This is the highest quality, like, the one in the background of how the camp looks like in Google Earth. I had also to do lots of sketching. For example, here, if you see, there was an interesting moment where refugees were trying to kind of remodel their dwellings, so I had to sketch what was going on because they were not happy with being, photographed, of course, with lots of interviews and walk-along interviews in particular. And I had to somehow also develop some kind of method that I called co-mapping, which is a process in which I engage with the interviewee in producing a series of maps and illustrations of how the space is being produced. It's not like mental map and not even collaborative mapping. It's something that I had to come up with in this particular context because there is no documentation. And the work I'm going to talk about is from my book, From Shelters to Dwelling, and also reflection on other works that I've been doing in other contexts, even in Germany. So these are the two camps, right? Zaatari camp and Azraq. We will be talking about them. And this is again the map. We've seen this map. So Zaatari camp was opened in July 2012, right? There was a moment that the UNHCR decided that, okay, we need to put Syrian refugees in camp because they are affecting the urban infrastructure. They're affecting underdeveloped cities, and we need to somehow, put them in humanitarian camp, official humanitarian camps. And this is a picture of how the camp started in 2012. Now, I tried to map, how the camp evolved over time. And you see the red dots are the added structure that were growing all over the years. And there was an interesting moment for us here, is maybe December 2012, when the management of the camp decided that they will have to plan the camp. Originally, they were, usually UNHCR camps are planned to be small, to be manageable, to be, they need to run the place to have a manageable infrastructure. So the idea was to have a very small camp, which is like you can see here up. But then because the numbers of refugees were increasing overnight, they had to come up with this kind of planning of the camp. Now, if we think about camp planning, usually site planners in camps are relying on this kind of standard, which is called SPHERE or Handbook for Emergencies, where they actually have a very clear indications and directions of how they have to plan the space and how they have to kind of come up with a arrangement of this space, right? So each family of 5 people, they will have a shelter unit. So they will have either a tent or a caravan, as you can see here. There will be communal latrines. So these are communal toilets that have to be used by everyone in the camp. They have to have communal kitchens, right? That to be shared, and also communal water tanks. But the interesting point for us, and here maybe this is also coming together with the idea of this modernist planning, where the principle of thinking about space is really very systematic, very scientific. So here we have a very clear quota of covered versus open space, and this is really interesting for us, especially people interested in planning, because as Sandy was saying yesterday, modernist planning is all obsessed with this kind of idea of categorization and putting things in place, really putting things in order. So this is here contradicts with how we live as people, right? The idea of the space as social, as political, as economic, as complex is really just simplified, reduced, and put together in this kind of diagram. So here you see these plots, right? We have plots where shelter units are put. Each family is put in one of these shelter units, right? And they share these kitchens, they share these toilets, and you have some kind of spaces for activities on the side. Now, when I ask my students what this looks like, everybody say, yeah, this looks like a jail, it looks like a prison. Sure, but the question is why? Why is this so problematic? And I always try to kind of like provoke this question. The thing is, again, as I said, this kind of idea of separation of functions, right? Trying to kind of enforce control through, this kind of planning, which is absolutely disciplinarian in many ways. This is the camp, as you can see it, and you can see that people start to slowly encroach on the space and on the planned space, right? Now, what we see is that between 2012 and 2014, the original layout of the camp started to completely dissolve, right? This kind of planning that they had here started to completely disappear. So, and this is what we can maybe call a tension between this kind of a humanitarian order, right? The kind of modernist understanding of how we should function in this kind of context, an emergency context, how people start to slowly transform this space according to their needs. Now, why did this happen? What's going on here? Of course, the framework that I mentioned at the beginning, right? Informality. Asif Fayyad speaks about informality and how people, use their dignity as, time, the threshold for taking action. So here, some of them were saying, my daughter has to change her clothes in the same room with her brother. This is very shameful for us. Or my mother is very old. I cannot carry her every day to the, communal latrines, etc. So they started to take action. And here we can see that the shelter unit, which was given to them, became something different. It's kind of, they tried to construct this kind of dwelling space, right? So something that looks like almost like a house. And interesting to us to see here on the right, these kind of different typologies are not necessarily linear. So the transformation that was going on, that was always taking, is always changing according to the family structure, to marriage, to divorce, to all these kind of things, affected how the space was being, constructed. Now, at the same time, the camp itself was being also dissolving, was in a way changing. So this you can see here, the communal latrines, they were gradually disappearing. Of course, people were taking the elements to construct, you know, the dwelling, the new space. Even some of these disappeared completely, and the management of the camp had to look at Google Maps and try to allocate them for the donor. Like look here, we had one that we don't know where it disappeared. So, you know, this is how they disappeared. People were actually using the material to construct, you know, the space of the dwelling, or even the infrastructure that was put in the camp, something like, you know, the for lighting that was used for, you know, people needed to have a fridge, they need to have an AC to, you know, to charge their mobiles, which are things that are not thought of during emergencies. So people start to take action. Now, in the book, I talk extensively about different case studies, so you can take a look. But I'm gonna speak quickly about one of them, which I think is really interesting. It shows a family of 5, right? Like they came from Sawara, which is a small village in Syria. They were put first in tents. They started, you know, they got this kind of winterization kit, small, you know, pieces of zinc sheet, whatever. They tried to create of them this kind of bathing area. But then the tents were replaced by caravans, and then, you know, people started to construct these kind of spaces, you know, the dwelling space. I can also talk about that. But this includes lots of negotiations, lots of, you know, economy here interferes, politics, social action, collective action, which led to the production of very complex spaces. And this led to lots of negotiations, right, between the neighbors, between the inhabitants of the space, to create what was missing at the beginning, which is this kind of hierarchy of social spaces, right? We need that in our everyday life. We need to have, you know, the private, the semi-private, the public, and so on. And this is just to show you how complex this is. Because from the outside, you know, this is the map that I showed you at the beginning, just very complex. It had all these kind of, you know, everything that you can imagine. And also it shows that people try to reproduce social life. For example, the Madafa that you can see here is a very important cultural space for us, where families, you know, they meet together, they kind of solve issues within the family. You know, it's an important element that was missing actually in the beginning in the planning of the camp. Now the caravan itself, which I talked about, came from different resources, right? It came from many countries. And speaking about mapping, I wanted to refer to the mapping that, you know, the keynote that we had at the beginning. These caravans were actually produced the names of the districts, like how people call the districts in the camp. So they called it Qatari, Qatta, Emirati, Qatta, which is not what the UNHCR understands, because people, you know, they have their own way of naming the place. So this kind of caravan were gradually transformed from an element which is free, you know, free of charge. It was something that was given to them, balash, yani, it turned into commodity because of its importance for this construction of dwelling. We can see in 2013 it had, you know, highest price. Also, people start to compare between the different caravans. For example, the caravans that were given, the ones by Saudi, you know, the Saudi caravans were considered the cheapest. The Bahraini or Kuwaiti, they were considered really expensive because they were sort of sturdy and like really good. So, you know, people developed like a very interesting understanding of the space, and also of the caravan itself as a you know, prototype of creating, you know, different kind of arrangements. And they became experts in understanding how, you know, all these kind of small elements of the caravan, how they can put them together. Even the price of the caravan, you know, it was given to the small pieces. For example, one of the what they call realtors, right? He explained to me that they can now construct an entire dwelling base of the caravans that cost 3,000, you know, Jordanian dinar, which is like 4,000 US dollar. Okay, I have 5 minutes. So, yeah, you know, people here again, deconstructing and what I call dismantling and reassembling. Also to the economy, they kind of produce economic things. And here you can see this kind of contradiction between what was given to them and you know, how they tried to reconstruct meaning of life in this kind of context. Now I want to just give a small example in these 5 minutes that I have of the other camp that I talked about, Azra. The thing with Zaatari camp, that it was considered as a scandal. It was considered as a messy, unorganized, out of control space, right? And they had to reinforce control. So they decided, okay, we design another camp which was called Azra. Here we can see the German site planner is coming to the camp to produce this new camp. They use this kind of new shelter typology, right? It's called T-shelter, which it's fixed in the ground so people cannot move it. And it has sometimes a tilted feet, right? It's a tilted entrance, sorry, this one on the right. So the camp is huge, of course. It was expected to receive, I think, more than maybe 60,000 people, right? It was very, very big. And it was advocated as one of the best refugee camps in the world because they relied they used all the expertise in the planning of camps to create this, right? Now, I work with my students on actually understanding the political, let's say the kind of controlling aspect of the camp because it's made of villages, right? And it's huge. You cannot walk inside. Like if I said I want to go inside walk, they will be like, no, you're insane. You cannot. So you need to have car to walk inside, which is something that refugees, they don't have cars in these camps. Only UN actors have this camp. So you see the arrangement. They have this kind of road in the middle, which it's almost creating this kind of panopticon kind of impact. Saying, the management of the camp saying that we want to stand between the shelters and be able to see the end of the camp. That was the idea behind this, right? But people started to kind of come up with these kind of informal routes in between the villages, and also they actually bluntly said that these kind of watchtowers, they are actually very well positioned around the camp so they can see whenever there is grouping happening, right? The site planner said, we put this in the middle, this empty space, so we know if there's a riot, you can see it, right? We can see that people are coming, right? They are the people are the red dots here. Now, the police started to kind of enforce this kind of, control over the spaces. The arrangement that they produced for Azraq, they insisted that it stays clean and organized. However, over time, people started to add things and change everything, and this kind of arrangement, didn't work out at the end of the day. Similar to what we said before, people started to gradually transform the shelter and kind of inhabit all the spaces around the space, around the shelter unit. Even the camp, because the camp was planned for 60% people, it's now having around 30,000. Lots of the shelters are empty, so people start to dismantle these shelter units and use them to create their own arrangement. Here again, the idea of dismantling and reassembling the camp due to the practice of dwelling. As you can see here, people, planting and even coming up with their own ideas of how a space can be, created. Just to wrap it up, so what I wanted to say is I wanted to put the emphasis on the act of dwelling, right? And the dwelling has the capacity to dismantle and reassemble the camp despite of securitization, and also that we cannot think of any refugee crisis without thinking of refugees' inevitable need to dwell, not just in terms of emergency, but to inhabit spaces in which they are found. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Please come in. Sorry that I was working as a police. Sorry for that. We literally have 25 minutes. I said it. We have 25 minutes for discussions only because there's another event taking place later on. So it was very interesting to see what really attracted me is how all these papers you kind of talked about this multi-layered. You provided a multi-layered and like a multi-scalar analysis on the politics of these small spaces. Not in your case. In your case, it's a mega project. And this ongoing negotiation that takes place between different stakeholders, whether state, non-state actors. And it was very interesting also for me to see different methodologies being used. So just for the sake of time, I will postpone my questions till the end if we have time. So I will take the questions from the audience. We start, yes. Is there a mic? Yeah, thank you. So maybe we can collect 2-3 questions. We address them and then we have another round. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for the presentations, very informative. I have a question for Madame Gokce about the case of Ghana. Several cases in the Global South showed that alternative or ad hoc services configurations created spatial inequalities. So if you can please elaborate about this in the case of Ghana, and if the initiative of the ship impacted or transformed any spatial inequalities, if they existed, yes or not, and in what way? Thank you.
Thank you so much for the presentations. That was incredibly insightful. I have so much to say. I'll try to just throw in a few questions. For Gokce, I mean, I read your book. I loved it. And one of the things that really struck me and that I see in your presentation today is this attention to time and who can dwell in which temporality. Today at the lunch break, we were talking about how some of us are forced to always live in the present, that we can't project futures. And I'm wondering how, with your work and these boats, and like we lived in Lebanon and our fear was every 6 months that the boats are gonna leave if they don't renew for them. So I'm wondering if you can speak of this temporality. For Sarah, I want to speak as a planner, someone who's trying to actually keep people in place and find ourselves increasingly stuck with tactics because of the kind of government we work in. So when I read your paper and hearing you today, I felt sympathy for the planners in the Aga Khan because I can't think of another way of keeping people in place. And I thought, that was brilliant that they were trying to keep somehow. And if you read the current literature criticizing greening and green infrastructure, the policies are not working, the governments are not democratic. So I wonder if there was any success or anything like that made you think, if I had to do it, were they so fully wrong? I won't ask Momen questions because he promised to stay in the summer, to come back in the summer. So I'll have questions. So we'll have time to chat, and I feel the time is short. But for Ayham, I wanted to hear you a little bit more about how confinement affects dwelling. So I feel that was so missing in this beautiful and sensitive presentation of how people appropriate and dwell in space. Thanks.
I have a question for Sarah first. Thank you for the paper, and I have to say that I'm amazed by the case of the Denizli family in Fener and what they did. And it's this family who lived in this house that had been built by the Greeks about 100 years earlier and so on. And it's impossible not to remember another Greek building where paintings were covered by Turks, which is Hagia Sophia, which was 1,500 years earlier. And the good thing is that actually it keeps the images safe. So when they uncovered the white plaster more than 1,000 years later, they were just there, and hopefully that painting is also there. Like Mona, I have sympathy for the planners in Cairo, but I fail to have sympathy for the Denizli family and what they did. Not because I feel like the conservationists who are lamenting for this painting. I'm not even sure if the painting is worthy of preservation, aesthetically valuable, and so on and so forth. So in your case, in your theoretical construct, I can easily fit the case of Cairo into it, but maybe it's only me. Maybe for everybody else it was clear. But can you please elaborate a little bit on how the Denizli families, this action of covering the wall paintings, how does it fit into your framework of reintroducing politics and operating within the market of neoliberal real estate and contesting it? And for Gokce, you already have 2 questions, and very, very quickly, if you don't mind, I don't want to bore people here with the nitty-gritty of Turkish politics, but we know that in Africa there had been already this very strong Gülenist network with a lot of schools and so on and so forth. I was wondering, what is the role of the state in facilitating this investment of car power around the continent? Is it only diplomatic, or there is also some, I don't know, state subsidies, or what's going on in that front, if you don't mind? Thank you.
So maybe we can answer the question, the questions, and then we have another round, if you don't mind. Thank you.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for the questions. I'll start with Mona's question because this is the question that my book is asking, basically. And I'm trying to answer this question by looking at energy infrastructure in particular and trying to situate, trying to understand how renewable energy infrastructure is situated as the future and how these infrastructures here that I described are become the liminal now. And how the aspiration for renewable energy infrastructure is fueled through the sort of the presence of the now and through the presence of the liminal. And one of the things that I think is really fascinating is that in the book I also look at the sort of the emergence of solar power infrastructure in Ghana, because I think because it was happening at the time. As I showed you the picture, it was mostly being developed by Chinese companies in much smaller scale than the other fossil fuel powered infrastructures, and it was coming with the sort of a promise of cleanliness and justice and all of these things. And I guess to go back to your question, when I started looking at what the solar power infrastructure did, and we were talking about this, Hiba and I were talking about this a little bit yesterday. What I found was that actually what was creating more inequality was the expansion of rooftop solar in across the country. Because what happened was that during the electricity crisis, as the at the government level, all these contracts were being signed, and big, fossil fuel powered power producers were coming in. Some of the people who had access to capital were putting up solar panels, and this is not only private individuals but also institutions. And as those institutions put up solar panels, they left the grid, and they became like autonomous actors who were able to sort of supply their own electricity needs. But the grid is still there, and the grid was still accumulating, all these producers, and now the remaining people on the grid had to pay for the new incoming electricity infrastructure. So electricity prices increased drastically throughout this period, and in a way that I guess you could say, in a way that incentivizes rooftop solar panels. But again, in order to access rooftop solar panels, the fact that you need to have upfront capital in order to access solar panels does not necessarily go away. So the space of inequality, spatial inequality, emerged more so through rooftop solar than through the grid scale power production like the ship that I showed. Of course, I'm not saying that the ship doesn't produce inequality. The whole presentation was meant to sort of show that there is inequality that's being produced both at the global scale and at the scale of, in a way, impoverishing the Ghanaian government further. They actually had to get a loan from the World Bank in order to pay for the power producers that came in between that period. But the promise of solar is also not a promise that's ever fulfilled. So I think it's also important to emphasize that and to show that the modernization cycle, that the 20th century sort of idea of modernization theory is being replicated now through the sort of the placement of these kinds of energy infrastructures as being things that follow one another and as things that will one day generate the relief that, or a sense of arrival, basically. I can say a lot more about that, but maybe we can talk about it over drinks at some point. But the Gulen question is really fascinating because when I first started doing research in Ghana, there were still some remnants of the Gulen network there, and they one of the reasons why these companies are becoming sort of so important for the Turkish government is because they have emerged as a means to replace the Gulen network. Because the Gulen networks generated so much legitimacy in Ghana to the extent that when the Galaxy School, which is the Gulen school in Ghana, in Accra was sort of almost being closed down or changing hands, there was a protest and people said, we don't want our school to go away. There was an attachment to those Gulen networks. And so as a way to so in order to sort of replace the kind of soft power that came from the Gulen networks, like energy companies and construction companies have taken on quite a burden in some ways, and they have become the sort of the they're serving that kind of diplomatic purpose. In terms of the financial questions are really hard to answer, so I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what kind of subsidies might circulate or how payments might be exchanged. Those are all, I don't know, those are not questions that I think fieldwork has been able to answer for me.
All right. Thank you both Mona and Amit for these questions. I guess I'll start with this whole idea of sympathy for the planners and sympathy for the Denizli family, which I think is actually really great, because I expected the opposite, which in some cases when I present this with in sort of urban planning circles, I am told that, you know, it's so naive to take seriously the social justice agendas that these planners are working with, which, and in this book, I really wanted to give them that space, right? And I can think of them as self-reflexive planners who actually sat in the same classrooms and thought of the same kind of critical urban theory that is being taught here, for example, and to give them the space for those agendas. And so actually what this project is trying to do is less a critique of that mode of planning and more of thinking about what is marketization doing to the political. And the planners allow us to see how marketization of the political reshapes where these political projects can go, right? And so they end up going to these spaces of the market as modalities. They're very smart. They're quite creative. They're quite ingenious. I mean, the Habitat Coalition that comes out of in 1996 that rebrands these neighborhoods, the private buildings. This is quite a move to do as heritage that should get that much money to be renovated, in particular, and so with so much care to the historical, is quite a move, and it's part of a global process to rethink heritage as an environmental process rather than a monumental process. It carries a lot of creativity, ingenuity, and I think we kind of need to understand that, but also understand that this is happening through a violent process of marketization of the political. And because of that, it creates these kinds of dynamics where you do have social justice agendas working on the ground. And I see that actually, some, you know, almost as a hopeful message of the book, that these projects are not all subsumed by neoliberalism, that they do operate somewhere. But they are also, in that sense, creating a particular way in which the politics then gets channeled through these, you know, crevices of the city, these spaces that are difficult to recuperate as kind of polities, and that is where I think we really should be asking these questions, right? Even though these social justice agendas are operating here, they are also creating a fractious politics that's very, very scary. So yeah, to the point about the Denizli family, I mean, right. I mean, I think I'm reading this. Yes, there's a lot to critique there. It's not that, you know, and what I'm reading with Emel Hanem, her agony, right? So she is very upset that this had to happen, and she sees it sort of as an invasion of the heritage industry into the neighborhood that pushed her to have to make these decisions. But it's a voluntary also, she's also pragmatically voluntary being part of that, because she could have said, I don't want you to come assess my house. But she wanted that grant money. And I think what I'm saying is she's really kind of displaying the really messy and contradictory politics of, you know, instead of subsidizing affordable housing in the center of the city, you have to done it as heritage for this affordable housing to remain affordable. And so she's really kind of opening up a conversation, or like a space for saying, well, if these were subsidies and you weren't going to come and force me to do particular things with these mosaics, I would have kept the mosaics, but I also would have been sort of, you know, there would have been funding for my housing. So I think that's how she's opening up the repoliticization, but through the very materiality of the technical that the heritage industry is doing. And there have many examples that maybe even might be a little bit clearer about how this repoliticization happens around contestations over the balconies and the paint colors and so on and so forth. But I want to give the floor to Ayham.
Yeah, thanks, Mona, for the question. About the confinement effect on dwelling, yeah, that's really good question. Well, it got me to think also about confinement as a general kind of condition in which we live. There is different ways in which we experience confinement. I think as we try to dwell generally, it could be economic, it could be, there are different types of confinement. I think what's happening in the camp is mostly this kind of politics of exclusion, right? This kind of imposed temporariness, that this is what creates in confinement. Because if you look at the example of Azraq camp, for example, right, there are people who choose to have a shelter there. They have let's say, a dwelling, right? They live with their families, but then when a family member dies, they can go and they can live in the city. So they can still keep that. They use it as they can go in and out. They are not necessarily confined in the space, let's say, but the confinement comes from the condition of the camp itself, that it is imposing some kind of temporariness on the space, on the dwelling practice. This was particularly felt in Zaatari, because when they tried to kind of compose these dwelling arrangements, right, they were trying, for example, blocks are not allowed to be used, right? Like cement is not allowed to be used. So they tried to use it inside as long as it looks, vertical, right? It's like not going up. It's not trying to show any sign of permanency. As long as, wrapped by plastic sheets and everything, the zinco, it's fine. So this is, how the residents, how the dwellers actually negotiate these politics of the camp. And I think this is where the confinement aspect is really just showing in the dwelling practice, yeah.
Thank you, Ahmed. So, Mona, you had a question? No, I think,
well, it's also for Sara, so if there's someone else. Okay, I'll go. So thank you all for these talks. I'm going to ask my question in the interest of time to Sara. So you talk about how neoliberalism makes the political disappear and the sort of critiques of it, and it moves into buildings and into market logics, right? So I think I understand the critiques of the people you're talking about Harvey and other people, but I think of it personally less about the disappearance of the political as about sort of the dynamic and historical iterations of class projects here. And so, continuously, and which is why sort of in my talk, I tried to solve that problem by just saying it's capitalism, imperatives, value in motion, right? So this is related to the question that you asked me that I forgot to answer until afterwards. But, what are the class politics here? And especially if it's based on ownership and based on home ownership and the simultaneous emergence of, simultaneous engagement with real estate and NGOs. I've sort of two motivations for asking this question. The first is that, my grandmother's building, which she grew up in and paid almost no rent for, was condemned in the earthquake. And as far as I know, in Alexandria, had no access to anything like this. So I wonder, what are the class politics here? Second, I was really interested in the discussion of value and commodity production, because I think one of the sort of most important parts of talking about value, capital v value, is to insist on the human parts of the commodity form. So I wanted to know sort of like, what are the interhuman social politics here produced through this contestation that is, I think in this part of what you told us, like very sort of material and object based. And so thank you.
do I need the mic or? Mona.
Okay, thank you very much for a great panel and for your contributions. It's I found very interesting how you're showing us how cities and urban spaces are produced by a multiplicity of actors, and the transnational also dimension of it, which is apparent in various presentations, be it through states themselves, or I don't know, what would you call the firm, an international firm or international organizations, and how they're also contributing a lot to the production of the built environment. And I think Momen's presentation also highlighted something we did not discuss over the past 2 days, these also traveling ideas from the Arabian Peninsula that are also echoed between Istanbul and Cairo, but also, it reminded me a lot of how much Cairo and Emirates and Saudi are also producing these new towns, these new cities, but at a scale that you showed is completely very difficult to grasp, I would say. So I wanted actually to give you the floor to continue a little bit what you didn't have time to continue. I'm curious to see what you would want to add, and also just maybe ask perhaps more Ayham and you, Momen, to reflect, and perhaps a bit Sarah. Gokce, we didn't see it too much in your, given the nature of what you're exploring, but these what Sarah calls the crevices, I really love this word, but I think the agency that also is apparent in your work, Ayham, and even in Momen, I really love the pictures of what you're showing us, what's happening on the edges and on the peripheries of these gated communities, and how people are trying to take back some space to make another city, or to, even if like it's tenuous and fragile, but I'm very interested in these experiments at making other types of inhabitation, or even if it's local economies that are transient. So there are more reflections, not real questions, but if you have any echoes to this, all of you, it would be interesting to go there if we have time. If not, I think food for thought.
Thank you. There's one more question.
Sorry. Thank you for the interesting presentations. So I have a question. The first one is for it's about the camps. So when looking at them, I was thinking that people, they like that organic, natural growth. They like having an impact in how they plan their surroundings and their environment. But then, like, when urban planners plan cities, especially like these days, we don't really see much of a space where people can interfere and make the city as theirs. But like in Beirut, if you walk around Hamra, like on the streets, you'd find people putting chairs, making the street feel as their home. And so in these other newer planned cities, does it not feel like the citizens are claiming the city as something they own? Does it just feel like a place where they're meant to be? And how can that change? And also for Sarah, something that you said that was very interesting was that politics don't disappear, they manifest themselves in public spaces, in private spaces, sorry. And so I'm really interested in like the relationship between politics and the way that we experience our daily lives. Like, are we actually in control of how we're experiencing our city, how we experience our interactions with people? And why did they become very intertwined? And should we draw a boundary? And if so, how do we do so? Thank you.
Thank you. This was great. Just my question to Ayham. I was just curious. I love the work, but how do these relators become relators? Like, how do you become a broker in a refugee camp? So.
Rena, can I ask a super quick question? It's okay.
No, we need to leave here at 5:30, but we can steal 5 more minutes. I think the panel is worth it.
Okay, that's not what I was informed of. Okay, go ahead, no problem. So let's answer the question.
I need to close the conference. So
Exactly.
15 minutes.
All right.
I will not take half an hour. So you can take 5.
Okay, then go ahead, ask your question.
I feel very privileged now. So this question is only for Ayham, because I was very interested in what you said. Now, I know you focused on dwellings, and that this probably was the focus of your study, and not and how it was like, they moved from non-permanence to permanence in their social practices and how they incorporated that. But I saw a couple of pictures where there were some plants, and I was wondering if there, did you come across as any the use of landscape materials or plants, or now I know that this is the desert, but as another form of establishing a dwelling and incorporating social practices of planting your food, or any sort of our fascination as Arabs as using our public spaces to plant our plants and take care of them, and that's just my question. Thank you.
And Gokce has a question.
I just wanted to know how a gated community that's the size of 600,000 people is a gated community and not a city. How do we make that differentiation between those two forms? And I wondered, like, how do people living in them make those, or the developers? What's the?
Okay. This is. Thank you. Thank you, Mona. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for the questions. Okay. I'll tie the two actually, because probably, and this is something I'm struggling with, because it's not really gated community, and we're stuck by the epistemologies given to us by definitions and urban grammar coming from the global north. So let me say a vignette that happened in 1998. That it's a story that was delivered by through ethnography, by an interview with a Coptic who is living in one of the gated community. So in 1998, Talat Mustafa, who is a real estate developer, gathered the Egyptian Christians in Heliopolis club, sporting club, and told them that if you move to the desert, to my gated community, I will build a church for you. And here, this is a very tricky thing, because initiation or the issuing of a church requires presidential decree directly from the president. And this is actually a crack and a rupture in the law that has been insinuated since 1853 by the Humayuni law of the Ottoman Empire. And the purpose of it is actually to, at that time, the logic of it is actually to give minorities, so to say, and more religious rights through allegiance to the wali or the khalifa or. But that notion has been transformed and reused multiple times by presidents to subdue and create this kind of connectivity. And here it's interesting, because this is where class, religious rights, discrimination cut across and actually led to Christians to gather around and actually support that kind of proposal, that at the beginning it was the church and how it is planned in the gated community. It was inside the heart of it. Then the developer told them, I'm not going to financialize it, turned at the edge. Then it became that you self-financialize it. And actually the same mindset that the regime, the new regime, the president, used it to create the new church at the new capital. So in that regard, the sense of the gatedness allowed that state of exception. And it is that state of exception that a lot of inhabitants, and here's a very tricky thing. What happens when you are stuck in the middle of urban processes, in the urban of hegemonies that are beyond being able to capture? And this is where I use the work of Akil Mbembe, the urban passant, which is the passant as the pas that is negation, but yet it's a step. It is incorporating for the yet to come. It's a process of happening by which you begin to open the door. So this sense of boundaries are being, the gatedness are being made and remade arrangements that actually allow for multiple operations to operate otherwise outside, which is so ironic, wouldn't be allowed. So it's a very interesting way of thinking about the frontier and the opacity and the opaqueness it allows. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for the question. I will also try to be quick. It seems like we're pressured for time. Okay, so the question for the planning, I actually thank you so much for this question. I think it's really great, because you started saying that the way we plan, right, is sometimes maybe different than how we live, right? You try to kind of maybe hint toward this, that there is as planners, we sometimes fail to produce these kind of social spaces. And this actually takes me to something I wanted to highlight at the beginning when I was invited to the city debates, which was this kind of difference between, formal planning and informal, formality and informality, and the discussion that was happening, by Anani Roy and Sayyad about that formal planning is what needs to be questioned, because it was brought to us, from the outside. The way we divide spaces this way is actually not coming from the region, right? This is how, the cities, because the camps, many people were saying they look like Islamic cities with the arrangement. And I think this is perhaps relates so much with the production of the turf, right? And the way we function, especially with this visual privacy and the kind of hierarchy of space that's for us very important to have. It's not just something to just add to the plan, right? It's very crucial, fundamental for how we live and how do we design place. So I think informality maybe needs to be put forward, like in how we see cities, maybe open space for this kind of informality to emerge in a kind of manageable way. Maybe let's see if this is possible. It's tricky. It's a challenging task, but I think it's important to kind of pursue and think about. The other question was about the broker, right? The idea of the broker. And the brokers emerged in the camp because of, in 2013, there was a huge chunk of refugees that left the camp. So they were, the camp, there were many empty caravans. And some people thought, okay, we will manage these commodities, right? Because they emerged as a commodity at some point. So they were like, okay, we manage this. So whoever wants to have a caravan, they can come to us and we manage with the construction. So when you talk to them, they immediately say, no, we are not brokers, and people think we are. You have lots of money. We don't have money, and it's bad, and everything is not working. But they have, some few caravans here and there that they use, and especially they can get higher in price because of demand. Suddenly, there's so much demand that people want to expand the dwelling arrangement, so they become really expensive. So it's like almost like a stock market, really working on its own. Regarding the planting, I mean, of course, almost all refugees that I have encountered in camps in Jordan and in Germany, they have so much emphasis on planting and making connection to nature. Some of them even said that, it makes us feel alive. And in the context of camps in Jordan, they are not allowed to plant. Trees are not allowed because there are signs of permanency, of course. However, people, they find ways of bringing the trees into their arrangement. They, it came out of itself. It was just here. It just suddenly appeared. It's not me. So they try to incorporate it in their, to make the city greener. But this is a challenge. I remembered something also regarding to this question about planning, because during interviews we have been looking at refugee camps in Germany. And one of the interesting points, because all these camps and shelters were also transformed, just exactly like what I've shown here. And the interesting thing, because we were discussing with the manager of one of the camps, and she was like, yeah, this is okay. This is how this is planned according to the German way of life. And I was like, interesting, 13 square meter, German way of life. But actually, it's maybe true, because they kind of think that this is how dwelling space can actually be managed. Like you can live with this kind of minimal, because if you think in history, this kind of minimal architecture emerged because of this kind of work, the working class, this crisis of housing. So they kind of have this in their history. But for us, impossible. People coming with 12 members of the family, they are split over all these kind of small rooms. So it is interesting. Yes, that's it. I just don't want to speak so much, Sarah.
Thank you all for the questions. Karim, really quickly to the class politics. The renting and ownership, actually, for the neighborhoods I saw where affordable housing, these projects to safeguard affordable housing, were actually very keen to keep renters where they are. So for Darb al-Ahmar, 68% of the population in that neighborhood was on long-term rent control contracts, and the project worked really hard to make sure no one lost their contracts through this work. And the other, Fener Balat, it was actually part of what you had to sign as an owner if your house was being renovated, was that you would not be increasing rent or kicking renters out. So there was a lot of very kind of reflexivity around rentership ownership. But class politics does enter in two ways, right? You have a two-finger? Yes, and because actually in the case of the Al Khan Foundation, they didn't have the option. It was the residents who decide whether or not they will volunteer for this, and they paid because the Al Khan requires you to pay 30% of the grant of the money, and so the renters pay. But in the case of the Fener Balat thing, I mean, it's a whole thing about like, well, in the long term, we will make use of this. So it's also questions about how successful is this, given the temporality of it. But the class politics does operate in other ways, which is first, I mean, the whole point of this is to say that class politics are more alive and well than we would presume from a literature that says that a corporate capitalist class has been quite successful in taking over with the systemic shift towards neoliberalism. I'm trying to argue that there's more friction. But the other hand, when you see how these projects actually operate, all the things that we critique the development industry for in terms of the kinds of judgments that seep through and through which funding goes to one family and not the other, there's a lot of like class connotations and so on and so forth that operate on that level. But there's also a huge class politics, because my book is not just about affordable housing. It's also about how all of these strategies are being used to corner real estate markets, and so you work against the free market to actually produce tremendous amounts of profits in the luxury market. And so there's no time to talk about that here, but that is the other side of this. And my project is to say all of these are working together to produce a particular kind of fractious politics, which gets me to the second question. Are we in control of our own politics if politics is seeping into the private in this way? I don't know. I mean, the answer is, are we ever? But the short answer. The longer answer is to say, well, there's something to be said about awareness of how that politics seeps into the private and particular moments over time in relation to particular systemic shifts. But the thing I want to say is also an opportunity to think about. The book kind of concludes with this idea of saying, these neoliberal transformations, a lot of them were then afterwards we see a major kind of surge in populism in Turkey and Egypt, for example, and many other spaces. And people saw that as a reaction to neoliberalism, a break from, the rule of law, et cetera, et cetera. And I argue it is neoliberalism. It is neoliberal politics. This is what it looks like. And it's a continuation, because if we truly understand how neoliberalism operates in producing that kind of fractious politics that then creates the space for conspiracy theory, it's not, or whatever else kind of fuels populism. It's not a break. I mean, we really truly need to understand. That's kind of the point I'm trying to make.
Well, thank you for the question on the crevices. And I mean, in a way, the project I'm working on is about the relationship between geopolitics and time. So, but even though those are ideas that might seem quite formidable and big, I think one thing that's been really interesting to see is how different forms of affect or different forms of everyday routines and everyday patterns of people working in these companies actually allow or facilitate those relationships and allow for the kind of emergence of the kind of temporalities or geopolitics that I was talking about. So, for instance, one of the things that I'm not sure if this is necessarily qualifies as a crevice, I guess, but one of the things that I found quite surprising was how much affection the people who worked on the ships felt for the ships themselves. And I didn't really talk at all about what happens inside the ships in this presentation, but the reason I started doing research in Ghana was because the company gave me access to that ship and only to that ship, and I was able to spend time in it. And the people who work on these ships are used to work on oil tankers, and if you work in an oil tanker, then you can only spend so many days on a ship. But they feel there are patterns of attachment that happen between the ships and the workers on the ships. But if you're on an oil tanker, you're not allowed to go on the same tanker multiple times, and you're not allowed to actually build that kind of attachment. Whereas here, people really, those ship engineers really enjoyed working on a power plant because they were able to stay there
for long periods of time and actually develop those attachments. So I thought that I never would have considered that that kind of emotional sort of capacity would then be animating the kinds of geopolitics that I was trying to describe earlier. So yeah, I think that attention to the sort of the everyday then I think explains a certain kind of very large scale transformation. Yeah.
Thank you so much. The discussion never ends, so we can discuss later on. Muna, so thank you for the panelists. Thank you for staying here.
Okay, so I have the difficult task of closing this 20th edition of City Debates. So on behalf of everyone in the organizing team and of my colleagues in the School of Architecture and Design, I want to thank everyone, all the panelists, the discussants, for taking us on a fantastic, I believe, intellectual, collegial, and communal journey, much needed over the past 2 days and a half. I think I speak on behalf of most of us, and when I say that we feel blessed and grateful to have been able to engage collectively in this very special edition all together, acknowledging, of course, the ongoing genocide and ethnic cleansing in Gaza and Palestine by settler colonial powers and their Western allies. And we, of course, stand in solidarity and in power with Palestinian Sumud, and particularly with Palestinian women today, thanks to Omar for having noted that earlier. Just to remind everyone what we wanted to do with the city debates and what we hopefully have partially achieved or started to explore together. We wanted, when we conceived this edition, to unpack the multiple intertwined forces that are disrupting cities and urbanisms and governance and people lives today, and to explore the logics and illogics that structure these forces. Forces such as capital flows, we saw, I think, and we heard how these flows are generated by multiple actors that are financializing the built and natural environments directly or indirectly. We heard of states, of their planning systems, their security apparatus. We heard of international aid organizations, their paradigms and their protocols. We heard of real estate firms and developers, of entrepreneurs, but also of nonprofits, religious organizations, and armed groups. The other force we were very keen on documenting is the climate crisis that is exacerbating already much unequal and unviable land, housing, infrastructure, and life conditions. And we also documented the force of settler colonialism that is erasing, rewriting architectural and spatial histories, generating apartheid, ethnic cleansing, genocide, herbicide, ecocide, and many other sites. So we traveled across cities in China, Iran, Iraq, Turkey. Not much Lebanon, actually, Mona. No, but I'm not blaming you. I'm saying, like, you know, we did not have papers on Lebanon like we usually do. We usually have a panel or more on Beirut, but I think we talked a lot about Lebanon, and it echoed, perhaps through your walks and trips. So Jordan as well, Egypt, Kuwait, Morocco, and we reached Zanzibar, Tanzania, and Ghana this time. Interesting geographies. We also wanted city debates to explore the various modalities of resistance, especially those imagining other futures, other urban futures and ways of being together against and despite these disruptive forces. So I think if I want to highlight what we can take away, is that as critical scholars, reflective practitioners, planners, activist researchers, we we need to get busy doing at least two things. One, carefully studying the multiple actors, state and non-state, and the urban politics patterns of these disruptive forces. And I think Eduardo taught us well that how to do it, so thank you for that. So mainly through understanding historically their processes of urbanization and state formation. And the second thing that I would take away would be how we also need to carefully document, unarchive, I steal the word from Huwaida, I think it's a very powerful term, unarchive what has been made invisible and what has been erased, and analyze the struggles, the resistances, the experiments being carried out by actors and groups inside and outside the state that are contesting these forces, even if tenuously, imperfectly, or transiently. And be it through sharing information over social media groups, counter-mapping initiatives, reclaiming refugee camps as heritage sites or little gardens that are planted, encroaching infrastructures, establishment of care blocks, or making madafat in living rooms, I love that, or in camps. I think it echoed with what Ayham showed us just now. Or the organizing of militant bureaucrats, may they be inspired in Lebanon and in many cities all around. So I end with that and thank everyone, and especially all the organizing team of City Debates. Where are you all? I think they're setting up an IFI, right? Isabella's here. When, Antonia? The IFI, yes. So I'm not wrong. A big round of applause to Mona Fawaz, who didn't want to be with me here today. But I speak on her behalf with my thanks, and to everyone who traveled to be with us, and to Maha, representing Palestine here today, and to everyone else who spoke about Palestine as well. Big salute to all of you. It's thank you for transporting us to these lovelands, and thanks to all the discussants who are here and not here with us as well, and for the contributors and the panelists. And we're not done. There's still a closing panel in IFI. We're going now, so we need to wrap up quickly. Thank you, people in the back, making all of this possible too.